we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll begin the event. Thank you for coming to the event this evening. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the right of the speaker to share their views and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. In the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. We'll be getting started shortly. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us tonight for our event, The Trump Approach to Russia-Ukraine. My name is Isabella McNeely-Ansa, and I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service studying international political economy. Over the past 2 months, I've had the genuine privilege of working with geopolitics fellow Heather Nauert, hosting discussions this semester analyzing American foreign policy under Trump 2.0. Heather launched her career as a broadcast journalist, reporting for Fox News and ABC on major stories across the globe. Her assignments eventually brought her to Iraq and Sudan, where she witnessed the life-or-death urgency of U.S. diplomacy. In 2017, President Trump appointed her spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State, where she served until 2019 under Secretaries Mike Pompeo and Rex Tillerson. There, she became one of the most visible figures in American foreign policy. Today, Heather advises senior leaders in government and business, specializing in high-stakes communications. Heather supported Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, the United States Special Envoy for Ukraine, through the transition. General Kellogg's decades of service began in the 101st Airborne Division during Vietnam, and later advising the Cambodian Army as a Special Forces officer. He went on to command U.S. Special Operations in Europe, where he played a pivotal role in NATO coordination and later served on the Joint Staff. General Kellogg, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you for your extraordinary service, for the courage and sacrifice that you've shown in defense of American freedom. During the first Trump administration, General Kellogg had held multiple high-level positions, including National Security Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence and Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council. In November of 2024, President-elect Trump appointed him to serve as Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, tasking him with facilitating negotiations to resolve the ongoing conflict. In this role, he co-authored a peace plan proposing a ceasefire along current front lines, continued U.S. military aid contingent on Ukraine's agreement to peace talks, and a postponement of NATO aspirations. This past March, due to shifting dynamics at the negotiation table, his role was refined to focus exclusively on Ukraine, underscoring his deep experience and trusted leadership on one of the most urgent challenges in U.S. foreign policy today. Joining Heather to moderate this evening's conversation is Marie Harf, whose career in national security and public service has spanned both intelligence and diplomacy. She began as a CIA analyst focused on the Middle East, later stepping into the public eye as the agency's spokesperson. During President Obama's re-election campaign, she helped shape national security messaging before moving into senior roles at the State Department, as deputy and acting spokesperson at State under Secretary John Kerry. Since 2017, she has been a political commentator on Fox News. Marie was also a GU Politics Fellow during the fall 2017 semester and currently serves as Executive Director of the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. We are incredibly grateful to all three of our guests for being here tonight to share their firsthand perspectives on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To those in the audience watching our live stream, you can join the conversation on social media by tagging @GUPolitics. Thank you.
Izzy, thank you so much. Great job. And thanks to all of you for being here. I know we have so much curiosity here on this campus about what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. And there's no better person to come here to talk about it than General Keith Kellogg. It is such a pleasure, sir, to have you here today. Thank you so much. I'd like to start off asking you about some of the news of the day. We've seen reports that up to 150 Chinese nationals, not sure if they're soldiers or if they are just citizens, fighting alongside Russia. We also know that North Korea has sent troops. About 1,000 or so have died in Kursk. We know that Iran is involved in sending material, drones, and other things to try to help. It's a dangerous time when we have this many adversaries and strategic competitors working together. What does that mean for U.S. national security?
Yeah, Heather, thanks for the question. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. You're getting educated in life on something that's absolutely critical, and I found a lot of people are not as educated as you'll become in all of these national security issues. So again, I compliment you for being here. What Heather just brought up is significant, and here's the reason it's significant. Is when you look, it's something we didn't have in the first Trump administration. What you've got now is you've got an alliance of four nations together. When we tried to do it 4 years ago, have you ever seen this game Whack-A-Mole, where Whack-A-Mole comes up and you hit it in a game out there? Well, we always did that, so a mole came up and you hit it. Well, what happened over the preceding 4 years, all the moles came up and nobody knocked any down. So now you've got an alliance between Russia, between North Korea, a defense treaty, between China, the complete partnership treaty, and Iran as well. So you've got this something we didn't really see before. On the question of troops, well, let's use North Korea. They've actually put combat level troops into the Kursk region of Russia, fighting against Ukrainians, large numbers of soldiers. They've probably lost in the range of 4,000 dead, but they've learned over this. But remember, on that treaty that they've got, that's a defense treaty. So what I'm telling you, the reason why that's a danger is what happens if a war starts in South Korea, which you could see with North Korea. You could see Russian soldiers on the battlefield there. So they've got that. With the Chinese that you're seeing, there's an axiom in the military: the first report is always wrong. And this is one of those, let's sit back and see how this plays out, because it could be volunteers. The Ukraine has the same thing with volunteers. The Americans have volunteered, Brits have volunteers, French, and what they call the Legion that's there. So these could be volunteers. First of all, they're not very smart if they're regular military, because they're carrying their own passports, they're carrying credit cards. You know, I don't know where they'd use them at, but so there weren't a disciplined, quote, military. So this is one of those, I'm just not sure what it looks like. But the implications are significant, because now you've got these four nations working together, something we didn't have before. And that has international impact. So this fighting in what you're seeing now in Ukraine and Russia, this is now a global issue. And that everybody has to understand it, because you now got the Far East, the Mid East with Iran, and then in Europe, the European region as well. So you kind of have to watch how this is being played out. And this war, by the way, just so you'll know, this is what I would call industrial level warfare, killing. When you look at right now the casualties, we haven't seen casualties like this since World War II. And what I mean by that, if you add the dead and the wounded combined of Russian soldiers, not civilians, Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers, we are over 1 million. Think about that. I mean, the Ukrainians have lost more than we lost in the Korean War and the Vietnam War combined. The Russians in Afghanistan, then the Soviets, lost 18,000 in Afghanistan and left. So these numbers, it's just absolutely stunning to me, the amount of loss of life in that. And that's the reason why President Trump has said we've got to figure a way to stop the killing, number one, because you're seeing what's happened recently in the attacks on civilians, but also the simple fact that what you're seeing, the death on the battlefield. It's levels that, and I'm a former retired soldier, there are levels, it just stuns me that you see that. And we are talking about the use of the weaponry that is World War II levels of bombardment and how they're using them. It's just a stunning level.
Thank you.
I wonder, picking up on that, and first I should say for the students, having been a geopolitics fellow, this is one of the great things about Georgetown. The three of us probably don't agree on everything politically, I would say, but we agree that this is a really important issue to get solved. And having this conversation with my former colleague from the State Department, although we weren't there together, I think models something that all of you should be emulating, so I'm going to start off by saying that. But General, picking up on what you said, is one of the reasons the Russians are looking to other countries for support, material support, for support on the battlefield, is because they are running out of people. And should that tell us something that there's a pressure point? And relatedly, for Iran and China, are there things they're not willing to do? Right, so could Russia overplay its hand and over-relying on some of these alliances that are somewhat ideological, but also alliances of convenience, right? Anti-U.S., anti-Western. Like, what should this tell us about Russia's strength at this point in the war?
Yeah, to start with, you have to go back historically with the Russians and the Soviet Union. They absorb losses. I mean, this is a nation that lost 70,000 soldiers killed in Stalingrad in 6 months. They just absorb that on a personal level. It's called attrition warfare. One thing I've always said in the military, you never wanted to get into an attrition fight with the Russians because they will absorb that.
They're just willing to take it.
Willing to take the punishment out there. So you have to kind of look at it. Everybody always defaults in the political realm, in the military. You always default to kinetics. How many can you kill? That doesn't work. Sometimes you have to say, there's another way to approach this thing besides just kinetics. It's either diplomacy or economics, however you want to do it. So I think when it comes to the losses, they're willing to absorb it. Putin doesn't care. He doesn't care at all. I mean, you hear that he does, but I mean, you wouldn't throw that many soldiers at it. The Ukrainians on their side there, I've got a concern with them. And if you go back historically and look in warfare that you've seen, like attrition warfare, you almost have to go back to World War I with the British in the fields in France in trench warfare. They still call that generation in Britain the lost generation. And what you have to think about is, are the Ukrainians willing to go to a lost generation? And I can show you demographically how that is hurting them right now. You don't want to get there. They care more about it than the Russians do. So you have to approach this differently. So how do you approach it? Do you approach it economically? Do you approach it diplomatically? And you do a combination of other. I happen to work in full awareness. I started with President Trump in 2015. I admire the heck out of the guy. His instincts are off the charts, and knows that. That's the reason it's full disclosure. I've been with him for a long time, kind of knows. And he kind of sees through that. So the question is, if it's not kinetics, how do you get there? And I think that maybe the pressure we're going to have to put on the Russians actually is a cross between economics and diplomacy, because the killing is going to continue, you like it or not. So you got to figure, stop the killing, how do you get there?
So I want to ask you about that, but first you brought up the length of time that you've been advising President Trump. Not that many people in the national security world have been around a principal for that long and have retained their position and that trust. I know you personally, you're not one to grab headlines or seek the spotlight. You're one who does the job. What can you tell us about President Trump's style and President Trump's approach to this particular problem set and your involvement?
Yeah, it's really, and I told you, I give you fair warning because I love the guy and I've been with him for a long time, and he really, his instincts are really, really good. He's sometimes pretty brusque in how he talks. But I told her, my daughter asked me the question, Dad, you should have written a book called Behind Closed Doors on him because of what I see him in there. And he kind of understands the dynamic. You know, let me just give you a feel for him on what happened. He recently had a talk with Zelensky on the phone. We were in the Oval Office. And it was the first time this was brought up, and we brought up to the Ukrainians. He asked, how do you get the kids back? Think about that. The Russians have taken probably in the range of 40,000 children. And Zelensky said to him, some of them we're never going to see again because the parents were killed. But he brought that up. And when we were in the first negotiations in Riyadh just recently, that was one of the issues we brought up. How do we return the children back to their parents? Because it's an issue for them. That kind of gives you a tell. And the tell means, okay, he's thinking about this, he's thinking about it long range, just not how do you stop the killing, but it's a compilation of that out there. And his decision making is quite dynamic. And I think it's important when you look at it, and I'll explain why I'm saying this to you, is when it comes to presidential decision making, the most important thing you can do is not with your instincts or your knowledge, but the ability to get along with people, talk to them. And that's critical, because if you cannot talk to your allies and adversaries alike, it's a huge mistake. You have to do that. Whether you may not like it, but you have to do it. And the ability to reach out and talk to people is critical. It's critical in life. It's critical in what you can do in your future, but it's also critical in negotiations. You just can't walk away with it. And he has an ability to do that. He's an ability to reach out and care of Kim Jong-un, which he did, or Vladimir Putin, or Zelensky, or anybody else. And he's willing to balance that. And I think that's fascinating for me. I used to watch it and say there's a lot of people who can't do that. And you can look at recent history to do that. And when you look at it, if ever you read every book in there about negotiations, the importance of talking, but also leadership, and the ability to communicate in a credible way what you want to do to the other side. And they must believe that you're going to do it, because they can't be bluster. What I mean by that is if they say you're going to come after it, you can do it. And because this is important, it's important for you to understand on negotiations. And let me go back to killing of Soleimani, when we killed the Quds Force leader based on what he was doing in Baghdad. And I was talking to the president on the 1st of January when we realized what Soleimani was doing and attacking our embassy. And he said very clearly who was behind it. We said Soleimani was behind it. I'm going to give you the shortened version. And basically, because this was on 1 January. And we said we're going to go after Soleimani. On 3 January, he was dead. But we also told the Supreme Leader, if you kill an American, we are going to kill you. He told them that. Mike Pompeo said that publicly. Okay. Now, how do we know that took credit? Because a week later, nobody can tell me what happened a week later after that conversation. Nobody here can tell me. I know that. A week later, the Iranians shot down a Ukrainian airliner leaving Tehran Air Base because they thought it was us coming after the Supreme Leader. That message took, because they believe it. And that's the credible deterrence that you have to have as a leader. The other side needs to respect you or fear you, whatever it is out there. And that's the shortened version, but that's an interesting dynamic that plays. And he's got that. And he transmits that to adversaries as well as the allies. So it's one of those, if you ever get to a presidential decision making, it's a fascinating way of looking at the world.
So picking up on that, let's talk about President Trump's relationship with Putin. The subject of countless millions of words in newspaper articles and on cable television. And I don't want to get into some of the sort of psychoanalyzing of why the relationship is how it is. I want to talk about what leverage you think the U.S. has that we can use over President Putin, and what President Trump might be willing to do. Yeah. I don't think it's controversial to say that he speaks differently about Putin than other leaders. They clearly have a relationship where they feel like they can work together. So I guess I'd ask, you started talking about diplomatic, economic pressure we can put. What pressure can we put? Will the president do that? And at the end of the day, is it your judgment that Putin will actually, there is an agreement that he would say yes to?
Yeah.
Those are big questions.
Yeah, it's one of those, I'm not too concerned right now about the Ukrainians coming into it. What we're trying to get to, by the way, and then I'll get in, we're trying to get to a comprehensive ceasefire. Comprehensive ceasefire means air, land, sea, industrial. Stop killing each other. Just stop it right now. That's where we want to be. The Ukrainians today are willing to do that today, to get to that position. And part of that is also the land. There's a lot of discussion of what kind of land out there that they want there. We know where Putin is coming from, but we don't know for sure what he wants to do. And you have to study both Putin and study Zelensky and study the people that are there. And he's talked to Putin a lot, but it's transactional. in nature. And transactional meaning, how do you get to an end state? How do you get to a solution? That's where you want to get to. And I go back to what you cannot kill your way out of this war. You just can't. I mean, you can apply all the munitions you want, all the killing, but you're in an attrition fight. So he said, okay, how do you get somewhere else? Well, I think a big way to do this is economics. And what I mean by economics, it goes in with the political as well. You've probably heard all about the sanctions. And I'll just give you one example we're talking about. When you look at the sanctions, we've sanctioned their shadow fleet. You all know what the shadow fleet is. The shadow fleet is, these are the reserve oil tankers that they've got, they, the Russians, that they put their fuel in there. Originally it was designed to hold it, now they designed to move it to sell it. Well, we've sanctioned each one of those vessels, the USS Kellogg, USS Snow White, whatever's out there, it's there. So by sanctioning them, you now can create a pub that you can actually take those ships off the sea. You can take them off the market if you want to. It would be like, for lack of a better term, a blockade or something like that. You don't want to use blockade because blockade is an act of war. You don't want to go there. Embargo, it was used in Korean War, I mean in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you figure, okay, how can you do that? And you can cut down their fleet to do that, and it's entirely possible. You know, so the Secretary of the Treasury, Besant, made the comment. Scott said, well, look, when you look at sanctions, 1 being lowest, 10 being hardest, we're probably at a 6 on sanctions. We're only at a 3 on enforcement. So can you enforce that? If you start hitting them economically, it starts to change, especially with the price of oil. You know, if you can drive the price of oil down significantly, it really hurts their economy. And that's where you want to get to. You know, I think WTI, West Texas Intermediate, was at about $65. Brent was about 60. Euro was a lot lower than that. That's not really good for oil. So that's kind of where you want to get to and enforce it on an economics piece. This is like their sovereign wealth. There's $300 billion sitting in Belgium right now. Mm-hmm. You can take that money off the table. It's oligarchs' money. They will not like it if you do it, but you could actually sell that off if you wanted to. So there's a lot of things you can look on using the sanctions if you want to enforce it that gets you to a point where you make it painful enough that he says, okay, this is where I don't want to go any further. The issues that he's raised Ukraine and NATO out there, and very candidly, that's one that is probably off the table in the near term. Shouldn't be surprising, that's happened before. But the other is the 4 major provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. If you go top to bottom, that he only occupies one of them, Putin, fully, which is Luhansk, not Donetsk. But we have a policy. Years ago, it was actually in the 1940s, that we came up with, was called the Wells Doctrine. If you look at it, the Wells Doctrine says simply, you may occupy, focused on the Baltics, you may occupy this land, but is de facto, because you have troops there, but it's not de jure. We're not going to say you own this land. And we did that with the Balkans, the Baltics, and it worked quite well for us. And I think that's maybe a place you take it to. And I think the Ukrainians understand that, because there's no good, instead of trying to force people off it. And then you come to a ceasefire in place. Interesting, Konrad Adenauer in the 50s, he was the first chancellor of Germany. He wanted a unified Germany, but he knew he was never going to get there. But he knew over time this was going to happen. And sometimes in diplomacy, things don't happen overnight, unfortunately. It just doesn't happen. But it happens long term. And as long as you stay the course, you may not know where it's going to be, but as long as the alliance stays together and the world stays together, you can get to a point maybe that you want to be, maybe not today, and maybe not tomorrow, but in long term. And those are that's kind of the way you have to think about this, what it's going to look like.
And one of the questions I have is, as we see the attacks intensifying on the Russians' part, we saw what happened over the past few days, where there was a terrible bombing that took place in Zelensky's hometown, Kryvyi, at least 20 civilians killed, including 9 children. That really upset President Trump. And so we see the trajectory of this war kind of ramping up right now, while effective conversations are underway. So we are going full force with diplomacy, but yet the attacks have ramped up. How do you see President Trump, if at all, changing the approach?
Well, I think one thing, he's the guy who wrote Art of the Deal. I mean, that's simple. I would tell foreign leaders, and this is 4 years ago in the first administration, I'd say, you ought to read the Art of the Deal, dude. If you don't read Art of the Deal, you're making a huge mistake, okay? And it's just the way it is. And I think what's happened, they need to read that, need to know where to go, what they're going to do, and I think what he's trying to do is figure out how do we get to a deal in a very transactional way to do it. Because his first comment has always been, President Trump, is stop the killing. And you know, going into Ukraine, you see it. I mean, the people are very, very resilient in there. But I don't care who it is. And every night I was there, but probably the same when you've been in there, the sirens go off, you can hear the explosions. I was in Kharkiv, and the city was totally blacked out. We're talking about a city of well over 1 million. It was like, I mean, when you open up the drapes and you see nothing but black out there, you go, this is pretty impressive to watch, to see. And I think he understands that, but he's always said the first thing we want to do is stop the killing. I think he's right. And I think he's onto it. And I think he understands that it's going to be hard. He knows it. But I think it's the first time I've seen a glimmer of hope that we can bring an end to this war. And I think everybody gets better for it. The world gets better for it. Europe gets better for it. The Far East gets better for it. We get better for it in the United States. And it's our national interest to get this war calmed down.
We both nodded our heads when you said glimmer of hope. Were you talking broadly speaking, or was there something recently that gave you that idea?
Well, I think what's happened is I think you're now seeing the fact that everybody's talking, they're getting there, and the glimmer of hope, I think, is I know the president wants to get to a point, and I think we're there with talking, that we think with somewhat of the, and I don't call them negotiations yet, because the people that are doing the negotiating it's really the three big, it's going to be Zelensky, Putin, and the president that are going to have to, going to work it. But I think the fact that we've got negotiators actually talking in Saudi Arabia, that I think anytime you're talking, there's a chance of a breakthrough. And I think that's where you want to be. And I think the potential is there. I think, and I don't want to get ahead of, if I get ahead of the headlights, I get run over. I'm more optimistic, and that's hard to say when you see what's happening, but I'm optimistic that we have a shot at it. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk, but I think we're somewhere where we haven't been for the last 4 years. And that's where fingers crossed, hope we're there for the people out there, and the women, children, the kids, and candidly, the young men and women in the field out there, both young men and women that are fighting.
True. We're going to get to your questions in just a minute, but I do want to ask you about the minerals deal. That was something that you basically had all ready to go.
Yeah.
You were leaving Kyiv about 2 months ago, is that right?
Right.
And you received a phone call.
Had in my hand. Yep.
And this hasn't been reported from what I've seen, really. There have been some pieces of it, but you have a deal. They're ready to sign it, but the Ukrainians want an Oval Office meeting. They want to sign it in the Oval Office. And you advised them not to. And if I recall correctly, you said relationship's not ready for it yet. They pushed, they came to Washington, and we all saw what happened there. There are also reports that Ukrainians are coming to Washington this week to begin to have negotiations about a revised mineral deal.
Yeah.
What do you see happening with this?
Yeah, the mineral deal is it's a bunch of pages out there, and frankly, the reason we were trying to get it done early is to take something off the table. And to me, a minerals deal is also a security blanket, because American industry is going to go in there and you're going to extract it. Here's your problem you've got with the minerals deal right now, and I challenged some people I was with today when we were talking about the minerals deal. It's pretty expansive. I said, okay, what does the Constitution of Ukraine say about minerals? And they all look at me and they go, what time do I have? They all duck their head. I said, simply read their Constitution. That's the reason I'm in close contact with Stefanchuk, who's the leader of the Rada, their parliament. Because under Articles 13 and 14, that is subject to their approval of their Rada. Zelensky can't do that on his own. He's prohibited from doing it because their Constitution prohibits it out. That doesn't mean you can't talk about it and figure the way that's there. The second piece of it, which is important, is the last time they did any geological surveys was under the Soviets. We really don't know what's there. So you need to take the U.S. Geological Service, you need to get on the ground and say, okay, there. Now, my depth on minerals is like this. We import titanium, they export it. That's it, okay? I'm good on it. But it's part of the business deal that Scott Bessent has worked, and they're going to come here and talk about it, negotiate it, and where they're going to go to with it. But it's important, it's because it's part of a security blanket. that Americans going to get invested in there. And the president's also looking at it. It's a business deal as well. But there's going to be some particulars that are going to have to work. That's the reason why they're coming here to negotiate. They're going to look at it and figure, okay, where can you go? Because it's going to be, they're going to run to conflict, because now you've got a business deal, which it is, running into a legislative deal, which it's not. And how do you balance that? And that's what they're going to be talking about.
So I'll ask one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. What is your message? I mean, you work very closely with the Ukrainians. We all saw the Oval meeting. We all lived through the first impeachment that was related to Ukraine. I know a lot of students really care about the future of Ukraine here. What do you say to them or to the Ukrainians who are worried that President Trump, for whatever reason, fairly or unfairly, is seen as being willing to give up a lot to the Russians to get a deal here? How do you address that? You must hear it from people.
Well, you don't hear it. You see it and you read about it all the time on here. And look, first of all, you need to understand, Putin has failed in his invasion. Okay, he's failed. Is he in Kyiv? No. Has he got to the Dnieper River? No. He controls one of the 4 oblast states, provinces. That's Luhansk. He doesn't control the other 3. I mean, he's got forces there, but to do it. So they're looking at this and saying, okay, now, so where do you do it? If you want to stop the killing, maybe you have to kind of hold where it's at. But people don't realize how big Ukraine is until you get there. It's the 3rd largest country in Europe. To drive from Kyiv to the Polish border, it's 8 hours, and that's if you're driving really fast. Okay, and it's just a massive sized country, and so what you're trying to do is, okay, how do you get to a position where you try to balance the security of Ukraine and making sure they're okay long term? How do we set that up with the allies? How do we set it up with the Russians? Putin has been very clear. Nobody should have had any illusions about what Putin wanted to do. He telegraphed it. He wrote about it. He spoke about it at the Munich Security Conference. If anybody says they didn't know what his goals were, then you were not paying attention, because it was very clear what he wanted to do. So this is one of those, where do you go in making sure that Ukraine retains their sovereignty? I'm reminded that the first UN General Assembly speech that President Trump made back in 2017, he talked about the value of national sovereignty. And he said, if you're willing to fight for sovereignty, we will fight with you. In other words, be with you. And that's what the Ukrainians are going through today. They're fighting for their national sovereignty. And when you go in there, one of the things that has come out of this is there used to be somewhat of a relationship between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainians actually despise what the Russians are doing right now. And I'm just not talking about the western portion. I'm talking about the eastern portion, which is predominantly, there's a lot of Russian-speaking areas. But don't ever get fooled when they said, well, they're Russian-speaking. Don't go there. I said, if you want to really talk about, and this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, I said, that means 1/3 of Texas would probably go back to Mexico. You can't say that just because they speak Russian or whatever. It's not going to work. And I think he's trying to work it to make sure that the sovereignty stays. It's not easy. I will tell you very candidly, diplomacy is like making sausage. You may like to eat it, but boy, don't watch it being made. Okay.
What was Madeleine Albright's favorite? Madeleine Albright, former Georgetown professor, she said diplomacy is best done like growing a mushroom in the dark.
Yeah.
So you don't have to see it.
Well, sir, thank you. Okay, we have some questions from the audience. There's a microphone that will be passed around. So why don't you go ahead, first question.
Oh, mind if I hold it? Okay.
And
Well, that
tell
was
us your
awkward.
name, and I presume you're a student here.
Yes, I am. Hi. My name is Lee Block. I'm a Master of Science and Foreign Service student, and in my first year. So you mentioned Putin's goals, which was the territorial conquest of Ukraine, going to Kiev, and to capture the government. And yeah, he telegraphed that very clearly, and you're very much right, and I would say you're still right. Those are still his goals. He still continues to talk about, the sort of maximalist goals in terms of Ukraine.
Sure.
So, given that he hasn't really changed his position, it sounds like the coercive mechanisms that you mentioned earlier, sanctions and whatnot, the administration's approach would therefore be inadequate. So I'm wondering, what would the administration need to do to bring its coercive, its level of coercion on Russia to something commensurate with reducing Putin's maximalist aims?
Yeah, Lee, thanks for the question. It's a great question. Look, first of all, number one, I do not speak for the President of the United States. Full stop, okay? That's the commander. He's the commander-in-chief. I didn't get a single vote, okay, in the Electoral College. But he understands what needs to get done on a deal, and we haven't reached the point of where you get there. You know, you've only got so many options when you get into a conflict. You can try to do it kinetically, kill them. That has not necessarily worked every place you go to, unless it's unconditional surrender. Don't get there. It's diplomatic, and that is messy at best, and sometimes those messages get mixed. Or you can look at economics, and to me, economics is an area that a lot of people really don't look at. You know, I go back to what I'll go back to what Paul Kennedy. Paul Kennedy is a professor at Yale University. He wrote the Rise and Fall of the Great Powers from 1500 Hours Today. It's a great book. I'm going to save you the money from going to buy it, okay? What Kennedy said is quite simple. Great nations fall because of strategic, he called it imperial, strategic overreach. What that meant, very simply, is strategic failure means you fill somebody else's potholes before you fill your own potholes, okay? And so you make a nation pay that price to do it. So you look at what the economic pressures that you want to put on Russia, and that I think is primarily the energy, because it's a petro nation. That's where you want to push it to. So the question is, where do you raise those pressure points to do it long term? And then you kind of say to them, you've got about as far as you're going to get on your goals. You're not going to get any further. You know, we as a nation didn't do very well. Remember, we wanted to give Zelensky a ride out of Kyiv on an airplane at the first 3 days of the invasion. And remember Zelensky's comment, I didn't need a ride, I need ammunition. You know, you can have a beer with a guy like that. That's pretty kind of cool. But we didn't think he would survive. Well, we're in the 4th year of war for Ukraine. We mean the Ukrainians are. And I think now that's where you kind of figure, okay, where's the touch point? And I think the touch point's going to be economics on both sides. That's where you want to be. And diplomacy will follow that. I know it sounds crazy, but I think the kinetic, former soldier, the kinetic's not going to work. You cannot kill yourself out of this war. You just can't do it. So putting more pressure, economically speaking, the focus I would look at is petro, because it's a petro state. And when you look at it, if you can drive the price of oil down, as an example, if you got to $45 a barrel, it breaks their economy, absolutely breaks it.
Well, there are lots of levers that the U.S. government has that it can utilize if at some point they choose to do just that. Do we have another question here? Let's go right ahead. And if you could please just tell us your name and your role
Hi,
here.
thank you, sir, for being here. I'm an alumna of SFS. My program is focused on Russian and Eastern European studies. It's a long name. And I'm originally from Georgia. So we experienced
The state or the country?
The country.
Okay,
Probably
got it.
you can tell in my accent. And thank you for your service. I'm now American. And there was a reason why I chose to come here to the United States for education, went to Russia and seeked Russian education. But my question is really, I think economic pressures will be important, but what Ukrainians are looking for and what the rest of the region is looking for is concrete security guarantees, and NATO was supposed to provide that. Without that, me as a person from the region, as well as many my colleagues and classmates from Ukraine, we don't believe that there can be a long-lasting peace. There could be a situation similar to Georgia where you have frozen conflicts, and I think that's where this is heading, where you can achieve a short-term ceasefire, maybe what you said, killing may stop, but it will not solve the problem, because when Russia will strengthen, they will come after Ukraine again. So from where you're standing at the moment, what are some realistic, concrete security guarantees U.S. is able to offer? Whether it's NATO or it's not NATO, what are those? Because Budapest memorandum failed, even though there was supposed to be a guarantee. United States.
They never used the word guarantee in that memorandum.
Maybe that's what it is. But what is it?
That's why it failed.
What is it? What are some options? Like, what's our menu to choose from?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question, because you're right. What the Ukraine keeps asking, what are the security guarantees? And you kind of have to think of them because candidly, NATO is probably off the table, at least in the near term, because we know it's a red line that go there. But what about the European Union? You look at Article 42A, it's sort of like Article 5, but they didn't want to go there. It's not the same because there's no European army. But you could do something like that. But more importantly, what you could do is, look, here's why you want to go to a ceasefire in the near term. You can build up the Ukrainians. And one of the non-starters is you cannot limit the size of the Ukrainian military. I know Putin wants to do it. But don't tell me that the Russians have not been pounded for 3 years. They haven't succeeded in what they want to do. So you can create a Ukraine, and here's the term I use publicly. You create a Sparta of Middle Europe. You create a nation out there that is, nobody wants to take them on at all out there. They sort of like with Poland. Poland, I don't think you want to get in a fight with right now. So you create an advantage. You tell the Russians basically, you may want to fight again, but I don't know if you want to take this on again because it's, 2 years ago, the Russians were on their heels. And if Prigozhin had any courage since deceased, he probably could have gotten to Moscow with the Wagner Group if he'd wanted to. He was on a hot run to get there. So you create a potential that's a state you don't want to fight with at all. And we could do that with the Ukrainians. They're willing to fight, no doubt about that. They've got good support internally, with Europe. They want to do that. And the Europeans are willing to do it. I will tell you honestly, this goes back to the first Trump administration until now. When we came in the first Trump administration, only 3 of the nations, NATO nations, were going to 2% of GDP under what was called the Wales Declaration. You get to 2% GDP on defense, 20% of that was modernization. You're over almost now, they're still not 100% there. But you create this increased momentum, and the European countries have, and they're starting to speak out about that. You hate to say it this way, but they finally got their backup, and they're putting more and more in it today. We had some senior NSAs, Deputy National Security Advisors today from various European countries talking to them. The money's coming up. They're starting to put money into it. They're not just talking about it, they're really doing it. And I think that's going to be incredible. So you create this alliance with the Ukrainians to build up that. And the Ukrainians have got a tremendous defense industrial base, which they're building. So you can make a very powerful nation. And I will tell you, as a soldier, once you get into a fight like that, you don't want to do this again. I mean, their losses are terrible. Look, when their frontline units were mauled, the Russians were. The losses have been incredible, the leadership losses and soldier losses. Their equipment losses. They're bringing tanks out of mothballs that are in museums to bring them to the front lines. They're bringing in, T-62 tanks, which, I mean, when I was in the military, that was an old tank. Now they're bringing them out of storage to do it because their frontline units have lost that. So I think you can do that security guarantees. I don't think, and this is what I would call it's a European problem. This is something this is in your backyard, okay? The United States, we've done this twice. I don't want to do it a third time. World War I and World War II. Okay, you guys have got to got to get your backs up, and you want to be able to do it. I will tell you, I think for the first time in the last 10 years, I really see the Europeans starting to step up. I mean, this is no kidding. They're not just talking about it. They're manning up. They're putting funding behind it. They're talking about going to 4 to 5% of your GDP on defense. The Germans are, the Brits are, the French are, the Polish are already. The Polish are well over 4% right now, and that is by itself a determinant for the Russians what they want to do again, because they're signaling, and everything you do is a signal. The Europeans are good. Their backs are up and they're willing to do it. Something we've always wanted, because we are a global power, and we've got a lot of issues all over the world. I don't care if it's the Middle East or it's the Far East, and the things we've got to solve. This is one of those historically. Everybody's they've held our coats while we've gone into the fight. They've helped us in them times, but this is one of those we told the Europeans, okay, this is on you, okay, and you're going to have to come up with security guarantees, whatever you want to call them. By the way, have they been well defined? No. Are they in the process of doing that? The answer is yes. And there are meetings going on as we speak to do that.
That's a good newsy item there. Do we have any other questions? Okay, and if everybody could just kind of raise your hand so we can get the mic around the room. Sir, go right ahead. Tell us your affiliation with the university.
Hi, my name is Raghav. I'm a sophomore right now in the School of Foreign Service studying Science, Technology, and International Affairs. Thank you so much for being here today. So for most of the war, there was a very strong coordination between the US and Europe to coordinate policy on Ukraine. And this year that has switched a lot, where Europe was very frightened that they were being completely shut out of the process of negotiations. And at one point, even Ukraine was frightened that it felt it was being shut out of the process while Trump and Putin were negotiating. So I'm wondering from your perspective, why do you think this is a good policy for like the U.S. and Europe to do kind of separate negotiations with Ukraine, and how will it be good for the future of Ukraine and for our relations with NATO?
Yeah, great question, by the way. And I was asked that question a lot at the Munich Security Conference recently. You've all been to parks, right? Okay. How many, you've always seen statues in parks, right? How many parks have statues to committees? None. And so they just don't, okay? Here's what I told you when I was over in Munich. I said, look, you will have a seat at the table, but it's going to be a verbal seat. It's not going to be, we're not going to have like the Treaty of Versailles where you can have a bunch of people sitting around a table and working. It's not going to work. You're going to have the principals getting down and sitting down and working their way through it. That does not mean that the interest of the European alliance is not taken into consideration because it's their backyard. And frankly, the dialogue is very good. We're getting from them in the questions and it's dialogue back and forth. It's not we're saying this is the way it's going to be. We're the United States of America going to do it. We are actually getting feedback from them, and it's pretty good, and there's a good dialogue. Look, one example. Just 2 weeks ago, Finland's President Alex Stubb, was down golfing with the president of Mar-a-Lago. They spent about 5 hours down there golfing. You get a lot done on a golf course. I don't golf, I don't know, but I've been told that. But this is where and the European leaders are in fact talking to President Trump, and they're getting their views across. And one thing I wouldn't talk about, if we don't, one I've stayed away from, I don't talk about this as a NATO-Russia issue, because you'll never get to the table. You've got to kind of take NATO off the table, and you have to talk either in a bilateral or European environment, however you want to go there. And we're finding the Russians are willing to talk like that, and like the security force, the guarantee force. There's two things. There's a ceasefire monitoring force they're talking about, and a force, the reassurance force, that's the term they came up with. And that's a force of military forces. What does it look like? Reinsurance to be reacting to major escalation, and the ceasefire force, which is significantly different, and they will look different, and that's what they're in the process of doing. So are the European alliance, are the members there? Yeah, they are. Are they talking to us? Yeah, they are. Example today, I had a group of them in my office today, and we were talking about them. They're here talking to our National Security Advisor, Mike Wallace, as well. We have people at various levels talking. So the dialogue is there, but you cannot bring them all in, have a seat at the table. By the way, that did not go over well at Munich, I will tell you that. But it's being honest with them. And we tell them, look, we're not going to walk away from you. We're not going to say your views don't count. But we have to figure a way to get to a level of balance out there. Everything's taken into consideration. And I will tell you, I believe it is actually strengthening the alliance more than going away from it, because they do know that their views are being considered. We are listening to them as well. And we're not just listening, we're actually hearing them. And so it's taken into consideration. But it's not going to be perfect.
And Sir and Marie, as we've seen in government, that sometimes when you have too many nations together, having a conversation about something, sometimes you can't get things done. Or it's too watered down because everybody has to have a chop on it at that moment. So this is a perfect example, I think, of U.S. leadership under President Trump. Next question, sir, go ahead, right here.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a senior in the college. I'm from Rhode Island. Thank you for your service, and thank you for being here. You've had a distinguished career in the military, from Vietnam to the Joint Staff during 9/11, service in the White House. You're a recipient of the Silver Star and the Bronze Star. So I'm curious, what are the keys to a 44-year marriage, a happy family life, and a career that's not always conducive to that?
Yeah, I got it really simple. As my wife would tell me, I have married you for better or worse, not for lunch, get out of the house and find a job. That's the reason I'm still working. Okay, so, but it's just compatibility, and we're getting there. And I love my wife, who've been together for over 42 years. But the reason I married her, she's a paratrooper, and I was a paratrooper before Bragg. So if she wasn't a paratrooper, I wouldn't have done it. That's it.
Is that true? A paratrooper? And
Yeah,
I
yes, she is.
didn't know that.
Yeah, she is.
Very nice question. Anybody over on this side of the room? Oh, Izzy, go right ahead.
Yeah.
For the live stream, it helps.
Well, thank you again for being here. You mentioned, before a sliver of hope, we're talking about what needs to happen for the war to end, what's going on right now. My question is about after the war ends. Okay, let's imagine
Yeah.
that the peace talks work out and we find a solution and the war ends. What aid would the U.S. and other European countries be providing to Ukraine? You talked about the 40,000 children that are missing. What would we have to do to help them reestablish their democracy, reestablish, a safe and stable state?
Yeah, I think, Zelensky's their sixth president. Isabella, thanks. It's a great question because you want to look to the future out there. And, they've only been a democracy for a short period of time. And they learn like all democracies do. And I know what they want to do. The leader of the Rada, their parliament, Stefanchuk, is absolutely an amazing individual. And I think they're all kind of learning it's not easy when you go back to our nation as well to get there. And I think long term, I think as a sovereign nation, they're going to maintain, I think, the fact that they're a democracy. Zelensky's open for, it may surprise people, he may call what we would call, the Brits would call a snap election in the near term to do that, because his popularity is in fact quite high right now inside Ukraine. But I think it's growth, helping them grow as a nation out there, and I think there can be a bulwark. It's interesting, but don't mistake the fact that cultures are different. I don't care if you're from Georgia, I don't care if you're from the United States or you're from Europe. It's out there. Here's what I'd like to see happen now, because you asked it. It's a different way of looking at it. What I would like, because we have got global issues, we have got a way. To me, I believe we have to have a strategic way of fracturing this alliance. Meaning, get the North Koreans over here, get the Chinese over here, get the Iranians over here, and I think by fracturing that alliance, it actually helps the world get better because of that. That's not there. If you have a chance, look up National Security Council Memorandum 68. That was a memorandum we set up after the Cold War that focused on one nation, on the Soviet Union, and it was policies, procedures, and people and personalities how we do that. We need a new National Security Council Memorandum 68. But now it covers not one country, it's going to have to cover multiple countries. But I think we need to do that, and Ukraine's going to help us to get there. Ukraine, in a good way, Ukraine is forcing us to look at geostrategically that we haven't looked at because we haven't had a need to look at that way. What does the world look like in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and how would we bring stability to it? And the stability was broken when these nations did this. By keeping them apart, we were okay, and that's how we handled it. We had Kim Jong-un. We had him, in a separate lane, and it was good. The president went there. We talked to Kim Jong-un. It was, fascinating. I'll give you I got to give you, because it is a funny story. I will tell you. His nickname was Rocket Man. Mm-hmm. I tell you, I heard when he was first mentioned, his name was Rocket Man. Monday Night Football. President Trump calls me at home. And I pick up the phone, and I'm going, "Yes, Mr. President." It's like, and by the way, President Trump, I don't know where he gets his work ethic. But I don't even think the guy sleeps at all. But it wears us out. But he said, "Hey, what's going on with Rocket Man?" I thought he was talking about Elton John. And he was like, no. He said, the short guy from Korea. I said, "Oh, okay, got it." So that's where Rocket Man picked up the nickname. But he was able to pull him away, segment him off, and he actually established a very interesting relationship with him. It was fascinating to watch that relationship. I think he can do the same thing. Once you get this settled, I think he'll reestablish that relationship with Kim Jong-un. We start to separate that out, and they have nuclear weapons, and you start breaking that apart. He can do the same to the Middle East. He can start breaking that relationship out there and strengthen it. I think there's something good to come with all of this.
Okay, we have another question over here. Sir, in the back.
Hello, my name is Mark Vorini. I'm doing Eurasian Russian and European Studies here at Georgetown at SFS. My question to Mr. Kalik is, do you see any willingness from the Russians to actually accept the ceasefire, especially in the light of Easter, and there are some news about Easter negotiations, Easter ceasefire? And then another question that I have, what is your reaction to the recent news of a few Chinese soldiers were captured by the Ukrainian army? What's your opinion on that? How do you react? What should be the U.S. policy on that too.
Yeah. So the first part of the question again was on what, I lost. Yeah, I think we're close to, no, I'm not going to say that. I would like to believe we are. I think the first thing you've got to do is get to a comprehensive ceasefire, and then you can go to a peace deal. I think the Russians want to reverse that. I mean, we still don't have a peace treaty with the North Koreans. We're still in armistice phase.
Right.
So you want to get to some type of ceasefire initially, because once you stop it, it's really, really hard to restart. People don't believe that, but it is from a military perspective. Because if you can get a separation, if both sides, and we know this is what the plan is, if both sides pull back 15 kilometers, that's 30 miles. It's 30 kilometers, 18 miles range of weapons. You have a DMZ, then you can monitor that. It's going to really be hard to restart, especially if monitoring force to do that. So that's where our hope is to get to that point. And we'll see where it is, hopefully in a relatively near term. When it comes to the allied other nations, we talked about it earlier, I'm more concerned about the North Koreans than I'm about the Chinese, because I'm not convinced yet that these are not just volunteers who decided to go fight because it was a good idea. And the Americans have fought in Ukraine, what they call the Legion, Americans, the French, the Brits, whatever. Now, the North Koreans are a different story. Those are hardcore units. Those are fighting units, and they have been killed in large numbers, well over 5,000. They've been killed, but they're learning. It's sort of like, this is one of the things that bothers me. They're taking the lessons they've learned in the new war, and they'll take those back to North Korea. That's not good for anybody. So I think the North Koreans are there, we know that. The Chinese, jury's still out. What does it look like? They say there's 150, 155 there, but unless I see actual units, Brigade 1, 2, 3, 4 there, like the North Koreans have, it's a different story.
We'll be watching for that. I think we have time for one more question. I'm so sorry. And thank you all of you for such great questions. They really pay attention, right? These students know their stuff. Ms. Wunsch, go right ahead.
Thank you. My name is Charlotte. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service studying international history. And my question is, we have seen Russian interference in U.S. elections, and we've also seen Russian interference kind of more broadly in countries in Western Europe, but also kind of in the Scandinavian region, specifically with Sweden and Finland and Norway. What are the steps that the U.S. is taking to ensure that Russia currently is not going to continue interfering with countries beyond Ukraine, as well as the United States itself?
Charlotte, it's a great question. Now I'm going to give you a real-life answer. You're not. Because they're Russians. And they are going to continue to interfere because it's in their DNA. Now, so you have to combat that. How do you combat it? So do you want to tell the Russians, don't do that? They're going to, okay, thank you very much for your interest in national defense. We're going to keep doing that out there. So you have to have a strong foundation bulwark of democratic nations that can resist that. Because as long as you know what's coming at you, then you can respond to it. If you don't know what's coming at you, then you got a problem. So my attitude would be with Russians, accept the fact they're going to try to interfere in our elections. Be ready for it, and then be able to respond to it that's coming there, but be aware of it. And I hate to say this, but that's welcome to the real world. And it's not right, it's unfair, but they've done it before. You can make life miserable for them, we know that. I think that, and now move it to today's world, I think we're going to have to be very concerned when the Ukrainians go to a national election, and they will. It may be in a near term, sooner than we thought, but the interference of that election, we're going to have to watch. I think when I say we, I'm talking about the world, is going to have to watch that very, very closely to make sure there's not some type of influence on the elections. And look, there are going to be there. There will be attempts to do that. And as long as you're aware of it, then you can prepare for it. If you think everything is great and you're Pollyannish about it, you're going to get run over by a truck. And that's the reason I'm saying, I know what you want. I know in the perfect world it's that way, but it's not going to play that way. Sorry to say, but that's the way it is.
Sir, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you
Thanks.
so much. I know you have places to go, and he's had a very long week already, and it hasn't ended yet. Thank you for your continued service to our country. You have been and continue to be just a wonderful public servant. And I hope that's one of the takeaway messages that the school sees here today, that you've had a long and storied career in the military, but you're continuing to serve. And you're choosing to continue to serve. And we're a better nation as a result.
Thanks, Heather.
Sir, thank you very much. And Marie, wonderful to
Thank you.
see you.
Yes,
Thank
of
you
course.
thank you for coming on back, and all of you, thanks so much.
It's fun when we get to ask the questions instead of just answering
Exactly,
them, right?
exactly. All right, thank you, everybody.
Join us, sir.
Thank you all.
And thank
Appreciate it.
you.